one that is doubted the most. Most scholars are convinced that Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, did not write it. It was only attributed to him later to make it seem more credible. But early church fathers unanimously agreed that the gospel attributed to Matthew came from the disciple Matthew. Scholars argue internal evidence shows that Matthew could not have written the gospel. However, when evaluated, their arguments seem to hold little weight. And beyond this, other internal factors support the idea that the gospel was written by Matthew. When we look at this internal evidence and the external data, we can conclude that Matthew is in fact an eyewitness account. As we noted in the last video on Mark, this is one video in a series on the reliability of the Gospels. Many objections that could be raised against the arguments we present here were addressed in earlier videos. So we have good evidence the Gospels are reliable accounts that go back to the historical Jesus. But what evidence is there to argue that Matthew really did write the Gospel attributed to him? First, as noted in a prior video, the unanimous testimony of the early church is that Matthew is the author behind the Gospel attributed to him. The flyleaf of P4, which dates to around 200 AD, ascribes the account as the Gospel according to Matthew. Writing around the same time, Clement of Alexandria agreed and said, in the Gospel according to Matthew, the genealogy which begins with Abraham is continued down to Mary, the mother of the Lord. Irenaeus said, Matthew again relates his generation as a man, saying, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And also, the birth of Jesus Christ was on this wise. Additionally, Tertullian and Origen said Matthew authored a gospel. Irenaeus also says that Matthew, indeed among Hebrews, in their own dialect, put forth also a writing of the gospel, while Peter and Paul were evangelizing in Rome and founding the church. Eusebius recorded of the church father, Pantaenus. It is said that he went to the Indians, and the tradition is that he found there that among some of those there who had known Christ from the gospel, according to Matthew, which had preceded his coming, for Bartholomew, one of the apostles, had preached to them, and had left them the writing of Matthew in Hebrew letters. Apollinaris of Hierapolis attributed the gospel to Matthew as well. So we have unanimous agreement from various early church fathers that the gospel attributed to Matthew was written by Matthew. However, several church fathers suggested Matthew was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic. Additionally, our earliest witness, Papias, said therefore Matthew put the sayings in an ordered arrangement in the Hebrew language, but each person interpreted them as best he could. The problem is the Greek version that we have of Matthew does not seem to have originally been in Hebrew or Aramaic, and our earliest witness seems to be talking about something else, a list of sayings that was originally in Hebrew. David Bauer said, the originally Greek character of the Gospel of Matthew is almost universally accepted by scholars today. Additionally, the canonical Gospel of Matthew also seems to have used Mark as a source, which was written in Greek. This suggests the Gospel of Matthew that we have was likely written in Greek and not translated from Hebrew or Aramaic. Craig Evans says, what the elder says of Matthew, who wrote an ordered account in Hebrew, can hardly be in reference to our Greek Matthew. Extant canonical Matthew was composed in Greek. It is not a translation of a Semitic original. But that does not mean that the tradition of a Hebrew Matthew is a myth. On the contrary, the tradition of a Hebrew Matthew is early, widespread, and well attested. So although the Greek version of Matthew doesn't seem to be a translation from Hebrew, the tradition of a Hebrew version of Matthew may be based in reality. Evans and Craig Blomberg point to a 14th century manuscript of Shem Tov ben Isaac, a rabbi who sought to refute Matthew's gospel point by point. But he was writing in Hebrew, and he preserved the text of Matthew's gospel in Hebrew. Scholars today note it does not appear to just be a translation of our canonical Greek text, and it seems to reflect certain independent renderings of an older Hebrew tradition. It is conceivable it may preserve a few traces of an original Hebrew Matthew. St. Jerome also said there was a Hebrew copy of Matthew at the library of Caesarea in his day, which could very well mean a Hebrew copy of Matthew did exist at one time. So we have unanimous agreement that our Gospel of Matthew goes back to Matthew, but that Matthew also originally wrote something in a Hebrew language. But the Greek version of Matthew appears to have been originally written in Greek. To reconcile this, a solution has been proposed by my co-author, Stephen Boyce. Matthew originally wrote something in Hebrew or Aramaic, perhaps a list of sayings, that is or is like what scholars call the Q source. Later on, as the church was growing, Matthew published a new Greek gospel, where he utilized Mark, because it came from Peter's eyewitness testimony, and combined it with material from his work in Hebrew or Aramaic to form something entirely new. This was done to corroborate an official testimony from the apostles. Craig Blomberg that this first draft of Matthew was what scholars call Q. Then either Matthew himself or some other Greek-speaking Christian would have later incorporated into this first draft elements of Mark along with more distinctive traditions to create the Greek version of Matthew we now possess. This, of course, is speculative, but it does account for the available external evidence that Matthew did write the canonical Greek gospel, but also originally wrote something in a Hebrew dialect. Regardless of this, if we focus merely on the Greek version of Matthew that we do have, we still must acknowledge that the external evidence all points to Matthew being the author of the Greek gospel. But many scholars argue the internal evidence of Matthew cannot support this conclusion. Although most scholars think the author was a Jewish Christian who had knowledge of Hebrew and Aramaic, most also doubt it specifically came from Matthew. For example, why would Matthew, a disciple of Jesus, use Mark as a source? Surely he could just rely on his own memory. This is true, but we must remember Mark contained the eyewitness testimony of Peter, who was seen as the leader of the 12. Matthew would not want to contradict what Peter was teaching, and more importantly, why would he not rely on Peter, who was closer to Jesus and was present for events that Matthew was not? If my father died and I wanted to write a biography of him, but I found out my mother already wrote one, I would utilize it for my work, since she was closer to my father. Likewise, it would make perfect sense for Matthew to utilize a biography that came from Peter. And it shows Matthew was using a source of what would have been considered a reliable tradition. Charles Correll says, if Peter was indeed the authority behind Mark's gospel, then it is not surprising that Matthew would utilize Mark. Peter was a member of the inner circle of disciples, often served as their leader, and emerged as the most prominent member of the 12 in the history of the early church. Correll also notes the idea there is no Semitic element in Greek Matthew is ill-founded. Although the fathers may have overstated the extent of the Semitic origin of Matthew, modern scholars sometimes exaggerate in their complete denial of the very possibility that even a portion or substratum of the Gospel was first composed in Aramaic. W.D. Davies and Dale Allison note the author of Matthew knew Hebrew and likely Aramaic, and lists roughly 5 pages of identifiable Semitisms in his Gospel to support this. Craig Blomberg points out, Matthew's Q passages regularly show signs of careful Semitic parallelism. Matthew is not without his Semitisms, and we need not argue that Matthew or whoever translated literally. Where we know that ancient sources have been translated from Hebrew into Greek, e.g. with some of Josephus's writings, there are also clear signs that the translator at times rendered his text freely and paraphrastically. If he were a tax collector who needed to be literate and well conversant with the Gentiles for whom he worked, could not have produced a document based on prior Hebrew and Greek sources in reasonably good Greek style. So a skilled author could translate a work freely enough to hide the original language, but even knowing that, we still find evidence of Semitisms in Matthew's Gospel. Another objection to Matthean authorship is the story of his conversion. Mark and Luke say the tax collector that Jesus called was named Levi, but Matthew takes this story from Mark and says it was actually Matthew. Richard Bauckham says it's unlikely someone would have 2 Semitic personal names. So the story was originally about the tax collector named Levi, who was later conflated with Matthew. Matthew should have known the details of his own conversion story and not have borrowed from Mark. However, Charles Quarles points out, we have several examples of Jews having two Semitic names, like Joseph Caiaphas, Joseph who was called Kabi, and Simon who was called Matthes. The etymological sense of some of the second names indicates they were likely nicknames. The name Matthew means gift of God. Given that Jesus changed Simon's name to Cephas, and James and John were nicknamed the sons of thunder, it is likely Jesus outright changed the name of his disciple Levi to Matthew to signify a new identity and leaving his old one as a tax collector behind. The grammar of Matthew 9:9 supports this, as it says he saw a man called Matthew. That Mark and Luke used Matthew's birth name of Levi to protect his identity from his former life, whereas Matthew was fine with using his past as part of his testimony. Some scholars have argued that the author of Matthew appears to have had formal rabbinic training in Beth Midrash. If so, it is highly unlikely the author would have also been a tax collector, as no rabbi would have taken on a student who was also in that profession. But Quarles points out the evidence for this within Matthew's gospel is exaggerated. No feature of this gospel requires or is best explained by the training of the author in rabbinic school. His training in the Beth Sefer, his instructions by Rabbi Jesus, and his interaction with local synagogue leaders provide a sufficient background for the content of his gospel. In truth, there is nothing within the Gospel of Matthew that really threatens Matthean authorship, or is strong enough to challenge the external evidence that all points to the author being Matthew. More importantly, internal evidence can also be used to support Matthean authorship. Mark was likely a Gentile who took the preaching of Peter and tailored it for a Gentile audience. If Matthew was a disciple and eyewitness of Jesus in utilizing Mark's gospel, we would expect him to take what Mark had and enhance it with more details and accuracy. And this is what we find when we read Matthew in comparison to Mark. Even Dale Allison said, "I have occasionally concluded that, in this or that respect, the first gospel represents the past better than the second gospel." For instance, Matthew alone says Jesus spoke of phylacteries, which were in use in Jesus' day, and something we would expect from a Jewish rabbi. In Matthew, Jesus emphasized the importance of the Jewish law and teaches on how to offer a sacrifice at the temple, something we would expect a rabbi of the first century to preach on. Gerd Thiessen notes Mark uses a general term to refer to Herod Antipas. Matthew uses a more specific term for Herod, calling him a tetrarch. He also gives more sensible context for why Herod did not kill John. Thiessen says, Matthew's changes in the Markan texts are interesting because they show that a text that is secondary from a literary historical point of view can be more historical in some details than a text that is primary from the literary standpoint. Jacob Neusner argues Jesus' statement in Matthew about cleaning the outside of the cup but not the inside is likely authentic, as it is evidence of Shamma'ite Pharisee purity laws that originated from prior to 70 AD, when the Shamma'ites had more control in Galilee. The Shamma'ites and the Hillelites disagreed on the proper way to wash cups. In the Gospels, Jesus used the Shammite rule as a polemic against them, instead of the Hillelite rule, which suggests the saying originates to a time in Galilee before the dominance of the Hillelite school there. The Christian saying certainly originated from a knowledge of the Shamma'ite view of the law, and at a time in which the Shamma'ite version was binding. So the New Testament saying, whether or not by Jesus, derives from the period of Shamma'ite predominance, that is, before 70. So Matthew accurately described a Shamma'ite custom that fits with the time when Jesus was preaching. Matthew depicts Jesus speaking of the Pharisees on tithing their mint, dill, and cumin. This is probably authentic because it reflects rabbinic practices. As Peter J. Williams said, Jesus is saying about how the Pharisees were careful to tithe their mint, dill, and cumin shows specific knowledge of the rabbinic debates about tithing of dill and cumin. Craig Keener notes Matthew adds a line to Mark's account on Jesus speaking about blasphemy of the Holy Spirit that is likely authentic. But if it is by the Spirit of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Keener notes this is in line with ancient Israelite anthropomorphic language, which equates the finger of God with God's Spirit. He says, early Christians had no other available source for the idea than Jesus himself. Yet it makes good sense, as the climax of history approaches, the forces of God's kingdom and the devil's are arrayed in battle against one another. Michael Patrick Barber and Gerd Thiessen argue Matthew's description of Jesus speaking on clean and unclean foods is probably more accurate. They point out that Mark's commentary, thus he declared all foods clean, could be misconstrued to mean Jesus was abolishing kosher laws for Israelites. Matthew omits this line and does a better job at explaining what Jesus meant. This would be expected if Matthew was present for this exchange and could clarify what Jesus said. W.D. Davies and Dale Allison said, its teaching is probably closer to Jesus' teaching than Mark's account.